We shall commence this module by studying about the difficulties in implementation of strategy. Strategy implementation is the process through which strategies that are chosen for the business are put into action. It is the action stage of the strategic management process that nearly uses all of the management functions such as planning, organizing, staffing, directing and controlling. Strategy implementation includes different steps. Some of them are: first, developing an appropriate culture which support chosen strategies. Secondly, creating or establishing a suitable organizational structure. Thirdly, devising and utilizing an effective managerial information system. Fourthly, redirecting efforts. Next, preparation of programs and related budgets. Next, development of functional and operational strategies to achieve programs. The next one is development of policy and procedures to achieve with functional and operational strategies. The next one is managing behavioral change in the organization through leadership and motivation. And the next one is linking remuneration with performance. However, strategy implementation process is not limited to above activities. Its scope is much wider. Success or failure of any business depends upon proper strategy implementation, and for this reason, implementation is more important than formulation. Many of the people who are crucial for successful implementation of strategies probably have no role in the formulation of corporate and even business level strategies. Therefore, they might be ignorant of formulation process of strategy at the business level. So, unless this mission, objectives, strategies and policies are communicated to all functional and operational managers, there can be lot of resistance from them. Functional and operational managers might hope to influence top management about abandoning its new plans and returning to old ways. Due to this, it is important to involve people from every organizational level in the functional and implementation of strategy, so it tends to result in better organizational performance. Strategy implementation aims to achieve synergy between and among different functions and units of the organization. Thus, adequate strategic implementation shall result in integration among all functions and units of the organization. However, achieving integration between and among different functions and units of the organization is not a simple task. Each function and unit of the organization has its different goals, and these goals may conflict with the goals of other functions and units of the organization. If goals of different functions and units conflict each other, then compromise must be achieved between these conflicting goals, otherwise these conflicts can be detrimental for strategy implementation. The coordination among all functions and units while implementation strategy can be achieved through matrix of change. While implementation of strategy, there will be a lot of new programs which will replace some existing programs. As a consequence, there will be some new programs along with some existing programs. Now, these programs may conflict or complement among themselves or with existing programs. In matrix of change, these conflicts and complements are recognized by placing new programs on vertical axis and existing programs on horizontal axis and seeing interaction among them. Then overall matrix is analyzed to identify problematic area, and coherent situation or solution is drawn so as to achieve proper integration and coordination between and among different functions and units of the organization. Structure of the organization is one of the core variables for successful implementation of strategy. Structure should be compatible with strategy. Many of the researchers have proved that structure follows strategy. The structure of the organization should be changed so as to implement strategy. However, change of structure is not an easy task. Change of structure requires many radical changes from top to lower level. Change of structure not only encompasses physical change in structure but also behavioral change in the organization. Thus, both types of change should be dealt simultaneously so as to bring desired change in structure for the implementation of strategy. However, sometimes structure is so rigid that it is very difficult to change, and then the organization should work backward and change its strategy so as to make it compatible with structure. Successful implementation of strategy requires development of appropriate organizational culture. Now, organizational culture is deeply embedded within organization and it is very difficult to change it. Effective leadership and motivational tools are required to change organizational culture. Sometimes embedment is so deep that it is entirely impossible to change organizational culture. In such cases, organization has to work backward and change strategy so as to suit the organizational culture. Thus, for successful implementation of strategy, many radical changes are required within the organization. These changes are not easy and sometimes it becomes nearly impossible to bring in desired changes. In such scenario, organization may have to think about change in strategy. After studying this module, we will be able to first know about why strategy implementation is more difficult than formulation. Secondly, understand the barriers to strategy implementation. Third, analyze the interrelationship between formulation and implementation of strategy. Fourth, understand the models of strategy formulation. Now we are starting with the barriers to effective strategy implementation. Successful implementation of strategy requires many changes. However, sometimes it becomes very difficult to bring in desired changes. There are certain barriers in the organization which impedes to bring in desired changes. Some of these barriers are discussed as follows. The very first is non-participation of employees during strategy formulation process. Strategy is made by top level management and thus lower level management and employees are just ignorant about proposed strategy. Lower level management and employees have vague idea about vision and mission of the organization and they do not comprehend the rationale of introducing proposed strategy. As they are unaware of rationale of proposed strategy, so they oppose it at the time of implementation. The second barrier involves a lack of communication. Due to unclear communication by top level management about the details of proposed strategy, the lower level of management and employees are ignorant. They do not know about the usefulness of strategy, proposed change in structure and new roles and responsibilities under proposed strategy. Due to ignorance, they resist to change which is required for success implementation of strategy. The third barrier is resource limitation. During formulation of strategy, top level management seldom consults with finance department. However, at implementation stage, finance department has to allocate resources to different programs for implementation of proposed strategy. Thus, the budget constraints which were not recognized during formulation stage are recognized during implementation stage. Resource falls short to fund new programs under proposed strategy, thus hindering the successful implementation strategy. The fourth barrier involved is lack of coordination. During strategy formulation, top level management rarely consult various functional and unit managers. As a consequence, many practical constraints and problems are not recognized during formulation stage. However, these problems are recognized at implementation stage. Sometimes the sum total of these constraints and problem is so significant that it becomes impossible to implement proposed strategy. In such a scenario, organization has to abandon the strategy and search for another alternative strategy. The next barrier associated with is behavioral barrier. It is common tendency among human beings to resist any change, barring some exceptions. These resistances are very strong when a prevalent organization culture is deeply embedded within the organization. As reward of very few managers are associated with proposed strategy, so rest of the managers and employees oppose the introduction of proposed strategy. Without adequate rewards, the proposed strategy seems to be unworthy to the managers and employees, and they start dissenting the introduction of proposed strategy. The next barrier associated with poor leadership. Effective leadership has predominant role in changing organizational culture so as to suit proposed strategy. As organizational culture is a mix of various variables in the organization, so it is very difficult to change the organizational culture. A leader has to work on many variables simultaneously in an integrated and comprehensive manner to bring in required changes in organizational culture. Thus, a very capable and effective leader can only bring change in the organization culture. However, if leader has poor leadership skills, then it becomes impossible to bring in desired changes in the organizational culture, thereby impeding the introduction of proposed strategy. The next barrier associated is poor management. Managers of functional and unit level are predominantly occupied with the performance of their functional areas and units. They devote majority of time to their functional and units and are worried only about variances in their respective functions and units. However, they do not pay attention to strategy at organizational level and devote insignificant time on discussion of strategy. As strategy is at organizational level and functional and unit managers' tendency to ignore strategy undermines the successful implementation of strategy. The above mentioned barriers often create problems to bring in desired changes and as a consequence hindering the successful implementation of strategy. Thus, organizations should work to cure all those barriers so as to bring desired change. If desired changes are successfully carried out, then the proposed strategy could be successfully implemented. Now we move further with the discussion of interrelationship between formulation and implementation of strategy. In a continuum, strategy formulation precedes strategy implementation. However, both stages, that is strategy formulation and strategy implementation, are intertwined. The strategy formulation and strategy implementation are interdependent and interrelated. They have forward linkages as well as backward linkages. Forward link. The forward link is concerned with the implementation of the strategy. Forward linkage has following issues. First, creating or establishing a suitable organization structure. Organization structure should be compatible with proposed strategy. If structure is not synchronized with proposed strategy, then it can prove to be detrimental in successful implementation of strategy. Hence, desired changes should be carried out in the organizational structure for successful implementation of the strategy. The second is that preparation of programs and related budgets. Programs make strategy operational. Thus, several programs are made for organizationalizing the strategy. After making programs, financial resources are allocated to these programs with the help of budgeting techniques. The third issue associated with it, that managing behavioral change in the organization through leadership and motivation. It is very important to manage behavioral change in the organization. If behavior in the organization is not managed properly, organization faces lot of resistance from employees while bringing desired changes for the implementation of strategy. The next issue associated with it, development of functional and operational strategies to achieve programs. Appropriate functional and operational strategies are developed so as to carry out programs in desired manner. As these functional strategies are developed with an aim to carry out programs smoothly, therefore these functional strategies serve as important guidelines for making decisions at functional level. The next issue associated with this forward link is development of policy and procedures to achieve functional and operational strategies. Functional strategies serve as guideposts for development of policy and procedures at functional level. Procedures are detailed list of various activities to be undertaken at functional level to achieve the functional objectives. Procedures assure smooth day-to-day functioning of the organization. Through the above mentioned forward linkages, appropriate changes are introduced in the organization so that proposed strategy can be implemented successfully. The second is backward linkages. However, strategy implementation is not one-way process. Sometimes it is very difficult to bring in desired changes in the organization so as to suit proposed strategy. In such circumstances, organization has to work backward and even change the proposed strategy and choose any other alternative strategy which is suitable for present form of organization. Sometimes it is possible to bring radical change in an organization. In such scenario, organization tends to choose those strategies which are suitable for present form of organization with incremental changes. Hence, instead of focusing on profound changes, organization can focus on incremental changes. These incremental changes over a period of time can gradually bring in desired changes in organization over long run. Hence, implementation is not one-way process. Proposed strategy cannot be implemented in desired manner. When it becomes difficult to implement proposed strategy, then some other alternative strategy has to be adopted which is suitable in given scenario. Thus, implementation is a two-way process where both forward and backward linkages work simultaneously. Now, after discussing the meaning of implementation of strategy, the backward and forward linkages, we now move to discuss the model of strategy implementation. The model of strategy implementation with forward link is shown as follows. We have first stage is implementation. The model is just for conceptual understanding, but practically it is not necessary that all these steps follow above strict sequence. As already discussed above, the strategy implementation has backward linkages also. So the above sequence may work in opposite direction also when it becomes difficult to implement the change. So here each step in above model is discussed as follows. First, resource allocation. After the selection of strategy for the organization, funds are allocated for strategy through resource allocation process. The most prevalent technique for resource allocation is budgeting. However, before budgeting, strategy is divided into various programs and thereafter budgeting is done for each program separately. Under this, we have the first, that is programs. Strategy works through programs. Strategy is divided into number of programs. These programs are very specific and action oriented. New programs developed under proposed strategy may replace or coexist with existing programs. Now these new programs may conflict or implement among themselves or with existing programs. With the help of matrix of change, these conflict and complements are recognized. In matrix of change, new programs are placed at columns and existing programs are placed at rows. Thereafter, interaction among them is viewed to recognize conflicts and complements. Then overall matrix is analyzed to identify problems area and coherent solution is drawn so as to achieve proper integration and coordination between and among different functions and units of the organization. This coherent solution helps in identifying the changes that should be made for successful implementation of strategy. The second sub-point is budgets. After making programs, fund is allocated to these programs through budgets. Budget is pragmatic test of proposed strategy in terms of resource, since only thoroughly budgeting it can be known that what is the estimated cost of the proposed strategy and whether it is within the resource constraints of the organization. The second point in the process is structural change. Structure is very important for successful implementation of strategy. As changes have been already identified through matrix of change, organization tries to incorporate these changes into the organization. However, structural changes are not easy to implement and it consumes too much resources in terms of time and money. Structure can become culprit if not taken care of. Strategy and structure should be in alignment. If these two are not aligned, then organization can sustain heavy losses. There is no consensus upon the optimal structure of the organization, but it should be in tandem with environment and strategy. The third point associated with behavioral changes through effective leadership and motivation. Changes can only be incorporated into the organization if employees are willing to accept such changes. If employees are not willing to accept the changes, then they strongly resist to change. Organization culture is deeply embedded into organization, so it exerts a strong influence on the behavior of employees. A strong organization culture poses a strong threat to any change, hence organization culture should be developed in such a way so as to support the proposed strategy and related changes. Like structure, culture should also be compatible with strategy and it can be developed through effective leadership and motivation. Various leadership and management techniques can be used to bring desired changes in the organizational culture. If it is still not possible to change culture in any way, then organization must work backward and should change its proposed strategy with another alternative strategy. The fourth point associated with is functional strategies. Thereafter, strategies of each function and units of the organization are designed in a way so as to carry out the programs of the organization in an integrated and comprehensive manner. Functional strategies are designed so as to develop and nurture a distinctive competence for an organization. Distinctive competence developed by function can become competitive advantage and the organization can leverage these competitive advantages. However, sometimes functional managers are so much obsessed with their functional strategies that they may overlook strategies at organizational level. This kind of behavior of functional managers is detrimental for the organization. Top level management should ensure that functional level managers do not develop tendencies of overlooking organizational strategies for functional strategies. The fifth issue associated with is policy and procedures. Finally, policy and procedures are designed at functional level for day-to-day smooth running of the organization. As managers at functional level are continuously involved in decision making, policies help them in making decisions. Policies are broad and clear guidelines which helps in decision making. On the other hand, procedures are detailed activities which are carried on to achieve functional objectives with effectiveness and efficiency. Now we are going to make a summary of what we have discussed so far. This module discusses the implementation stage of the strategy. Strategy implementation encompasses all those activities which are required for execution of strategy. Implementation of strategy requires lot of radical changes into the organization. These changes can even be related to structural changes into the organization. When organization tries to incorporate these radical changes, it has to face resistance from the employees. Thus, organization has also to work for the development of appropriate organizational culture to requisite behavioral changes that can be achieved with the cooperation of the employees. It is very essential while implementing the changes and formulation of such policies and procedure that full cooperation of lower level management and employees should be received. However, making structural changes and development of appropriate culture is cumbersome task as both are deeply embedded into the organization, and any effort to change this may result in strong resistance. The strategy implementation is a very difficult process. There are various barriers to implementation of strategy. These barriers are non-participation of employees during strategy formulation process, lack of communication, resource limitation, lack of coordination, behavioral barrier, poor leadership and poor management. We have to face these barriers if we want to implement the strategy effectively, because in the absence of tackling these issues, strategies cannot be implemented. We have two types of linkages, backward linkages and forward linkages. The forward linkages means that company is moving ahead and the lower level management and employees are ready to change and to equip with the recent changes involved by the top level management. The backward link is that the organization is moving backward and it is making changes in the strategies so as to make a coordination between the employees and the environment of the organization.